Charles Curtis was a Native American professional athlete who became Vice President of the United States. During his childhood, he lived on a Kansai reservation. During that time, Cheyenne warriors raided the tribe, and he made a trip from Council Grove to Topeka to warn the governor to send his militia in the event of a worst-case scenario. From this true story, many myths were told, and some of them were heroically unbelievable, and others were that he told this tale. What we're going to discuss is the event that led to the raid, the stories that were told, and the truth of what happened. It's December 1867. Cheyenne Kansai men and women are 140 miles west of their reservation toward the Colorado border on their winter hunt. They come across an enemy tribe, the Cheyenne, and they agree to make peace because the buffalo herds have not come up yet. It's too cold. The Kansai are freezing to death, and they are starving to death, and they are approaching extinction because their tribe is in the hundreds at this point due to several bouts of disease, and the Kansai braves, having served in the 9th Union Cavalry, they lost dozens in the Civil War. Upon coming back from an unsuccessful scouting mission, they find that a herdsman watching over their tribe has been scalped and killed by the Cheyenne. Incensed, the Kansai warriors seek out the Cheyenne and over the course of 4 hours, tear them to shreds. They come away with 14 scalps, they lose 2 of their own. But now they have a problem because there's a lot more Cheyenne than there are Kansai, and this is a warring nation that is their business. So they pound out a trek 140 miles back east to Council Grove, during the course of which 60 of them fall, mostly women, and they lose 150 horses. Coming back to the tribe, the braves account to their elders, who they're responsible for. Braves like Big Henry Papan, much older in this photo, but he's about 19 at this time. He reports to his uncle, Joe Jim, who's between 50 and 60 years old. And if you look at this photo, you'll notice Joe Jim is missing his right arm. He also reports to grandmother Julie Papan, who here is in a picture with her granddaughter Belle, and other children of the tribe would have been told about what happened because they have to prepare for war. The Cheyenne are going to come for them to seek retribution for the fight they just had. During the course of which they come, there's a break in the battle, and an 8-year-old boy named Charles Curtis, who lives on the reservation with his grandmother, Julie Papan, he elects to go on foot to Topeka. It's 60 miles. And from this true story came many other stories that obscured the true life of this boy. I can't get into all the stories that were told or the motivations for why, but I do want to read an excerpt from Senator George Morehouse in what was called a history book. 35 years ago, a shy and reserved boy of just 7 summers, with fine features and a diminutive physique, was living with relatives at the Old Kaw Indian Agency. The plainsman David Lucas arrived the day before after a daring 45-mile ride with the startling tidings that Chief Little Robe and his braves were coming from the pathless plains into the beautiful Neosho Valley and through the streets of Council Grove. Great excitement prevailed. The few settlers scattered along the creeks, warned by the outriders of the clanging peals of an old bell swinging from the high tower on Belfry Hill. They gathered at the nearest refuge, Council Grove. Kaw chiefs and their white friends formed a council of war. They convened on a defense against the Cheyenne. Meanwhile, this little boy, hearing the war talk, resolved to be the one to carry the news of the impending danger to Topeka. On foot and alone, he fearlessly cut over the hills and prairies. Guided by instinct and the stars, he ran 50 miles as fast as a horse. These stories were told in many variations. It seemed a new book was coming out every decade that mentioned the Cheyenne raid on Council Grove. Some mentioned Charles Curtis, some mentioned his uncle Joe Jim, who also made the trip. In 1929, the New York Times writes a piece about the new vice president, Charles Curtis. And they tell this story. They tell a story of the Cheyenne coming to Council Grove, and no one knows what to do. What can we do? How do we save ourselves? We need a militia. Do we use the 100 Union cavalrymen who live here? No. You need a good old-fashioned Second Ascendant militia that can come and really save the day. And so this boy, he went because many did not know their way to Topeka. They did not know how to step onto the Santa Fe Trail and walk straight to Topeka, which was the commonly traveled road. And he spoke good English, which I'll hand it to the Times on this one, he did. He spoke good English and French and Kanze. Pretty much the whole tribe did. In fact, several tribal members were Department of Interior employees working as interpreters. This story gets syndicated nationwide and internationally. And so, coming away from this, closer to home, what does the tribe say? I'm in the middle of an oral history project with the Kanze Nation. They say Curtis left Council Grove on that day. He left and he never lived on the reservation again. Why would an 8-year-old boy make this trip? And he went for several reasons. He was able to make the trip. He knew the way. He also, someone had to go. They needed someone to go in the event of the Cheyenne, who were a much larger tribe, completely annihilating the Braves and kidnapping all of the women and children. No brave would have left because the Braves were responsible for all of the elders and children of the tribe. But Curtis was not the only one who went. His uncle Joe Jim, who, if you remember the photo, he's an amputee, he's between 50 and 60 years old. In the event that this battle continues, he's probably exhausted at this point. He would be a liability on the battlefield, but he could be an asset making the simple trip to Topeka. What does Charles Curtis say? Later in life, Charles Curtis put together a collection of his memories. They were never published until a few years ago when a Kansas woman named Kitty Frank compiled and edited them, and she released in his own words. And Curtis very briefly talks about the Cheyenne raid. In his book, he says he doesn't know why they came. They showed up, the children were given tasks of what to do, mostly getting the horses out to pasture, but also telling the people who lived on allotments to get to safety. And then when there was a break in the fighting, he volunteers to go on foot. He travels along the Santa Fe Trail through the night, and he arrives at noon the next day. When he gets there, he hears that they already know, and the Cheyenne are well on their way back to their reservation. And so, in his own words, he did not save the tribe. But what did happen? How did the Cheyenne get from their reservation to fight the Kanze Indians? Well, they traveled commonly traveled roads, and they were not incognito. They were completely prepared for war. They had extra horses, they were carrying as many weapons as they could, and they were painted for battle. Along the way, local law enforcement as well as town leaders would stop them, and they would ask them what their business was, and they would say, "We're coming for the Kanze," and they were granted permission to pass. When they show up, they do not find your typical American Indian tribe, perhaps caught unaware. They come across a modern military defense, the kind you might expect from the 9th Cavalry. You have defensive positions like a berm in the tree line. And so there were ammunition piles in secondary and tertiary positions. The Cheyenne see this, and they were ready. They were coming for retribution. They were prepared to fight, kill, and die for what had happened the previous December. But they were not ready to be totally annihilated. And so the braves on both sides convened, and they agreed to resume the peace that they had made on the hunting grounds the previous December, and they engaged in a full day of war theater that local townspeople came out to watch. At the end of the day, the Kanze send out a peace offering of food and coffee. The Cheyenne leave, and now there's a problem. You don't know if you can trust them. The last time you had a peace talk, they killed your brother. And so now, someone has to go to Topeka to warn the governor of the raid, and if possible, have a militia be sent for protection. That someone was Charles Curtis. Also, his uncle had gone. There is no evidence they traveled together, but they probably did leave about the same time. And this brings me to some final conclusions. Charles Curtis did not run 50 miles as fast as a horse. This, I am sure, is true. Tales like this were able to be told about him because he really could not entirely refute them, but also he was too busy. Throughout his political career, he was put through constant primaries, and his legitimacy as a candidate was questioned. This was a 40-year political career in national office. And he was working too hard on legislation. He put forth the first Equal Rights Amendment, anti-lynching legislation, protection of assets for married women, women's voting. And he was trying to form an Indian state south of Kansas. And leading up to this, he conducted some very controversial legislation. And it was that he had all the tribes broken up, and every individual Indian had deeded land that could never be taken from them, as it had of his tribe 3 times in 77 years. That state was never formed, but we did have another state formed called Oklahoma. And when Oklahoma was formed, their first senator was a Cherokee named Robert Owen. In 1920, Robert Owen runs for president, and he wins the opening primary, which, yes, it was Oklahoma, the winning. He won Oklahoma and none of the others. But in the end, Charles Curtis did not save his tribe. He did his duty as a member of it. Thank you.